And I would now like to move to the second speaker, which is Dr. Anant Jani. Is an academic and senior researcher at the University of Heidelberg and research fellow at the University of Oxford, also coordinator of the FIS project. His overall research focuses on understanding how we can improve population health by addressing the social determinants of health. And he's currently working on 2 different European projects, including the FIS project, exploring how we can redesign our food system so that all Europeans can eat healthier and more sustainable diets. But he's also currently working on another European project on how we can use novel financing mechanisms to fund interventions that promote health and prevent disease. His talk today will focus a little bit more on the Draghi report and the concept of competitiveness and how we frame this concept. Why is it relevant that we talk about it, especially within the project like the FIS project, and how also it can potentially shape the food policy debate at different governmental levels, at national, at European and global levels. So Anand, I would like to give the floor to you now.
Thanks, Sophia. Hopefully you guys can hear me well. Yes, I hope. Yep. Okay, super. And I will wait for Rainer, our wizard, to bring the slides up, and hopefully that works now. Okay, super. Maybe I'll just start off with a quick reflection on something that Tim was mentioning towards the end of his talk, namely the inability to map the London food system, and then also maybe tying it to some of the risks that he was mentioning. Some of these insurance companies like Swiss Re and Munich Re, they kind of cover this concept of risk versus fundamental uncertainty. Risk is a situation where you know the variables, you know how they interact, and so you can calculate the probabilities that if A happens, then there's an X% chance that B will happen. In a situation of fundamental uncertainty, you don't even know all of the variables, and you certainly don't know how they interact. And in a situation of fundamental uncertainty, this goes back to the work of Herbert Simon, and then more recently with Gerd Gigerenzer, who's at the Max Planck Institute. In these situations of fundamental uncertainty, where you don't even know all the variables, like Tim was describing, they don't even know how to map the London food system. Your best bet is to take a heuristic strategy, which is you take these basic principles. And I think a lot of what Tim was describing, for me, just struck a chord that this is just like really common sense stuff, that we don't want centralized food systems across the value chain, because that just opens us up to far too much vulnerability. And I think it ties into some of the stuff that I'll be discussing on regenerative food systems, which is really leveraging Molly's definition. Anyways, that was just a quick reflection on Tim's great talk and conceptualizations of our food systems and the future of our food systems. What I'm going to be covering touches on what Samuele kind of introduced and what Sophia was mentioning as well, and looking really at the outcomes and externalities of a competitive food system as they're currently conceptualized, particularly by kind of capitalist-driven societies and economies, and maybe kind of a reframing of competitiveness, looking at the metrics that I feel we should try to compete on. So I'll start off with just my positionality on this. So my background is more in health and healthcare, and a little bit in food systems, but even for food systems, mostly from the perspective of health. So if we look at health outcomes and we disaggregate this by length of life and quality of life, clinical care, so this is access to hospitals, doctors, nurses, pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, only accounts for about 20% of our health outcomes. The other 80% are due to these determinants of health. Health behaviors, social and economic factors, as well as physical environment. And these are just rough percentages, but these percentages will vary. And again, like Tim was presenting, looking at Gaza or looking at some of these climate shocks, if we look at the sort of devastating situation in California right now with the wildfires, Housing will obviously be a much more important determinant than 5 to 10% for folks over there, and access to nutritious food will obviously be far more important for those individuals as well. If we're looking at conflict situations, just getting the basics will be far more important than access to doctors, hospitals, nurses, and pharmaceuticals. And if we're looking at health of the population, in Europe, we spend, if we're looking at these non-communicable diseases, so these are diseases like type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, overweight. Every year, we spend about 700 billion euros every year on these preventable conditions. And for these preventable conditions, poor diets are a key driver. Some studies suggest that they account for about 80% of the progression to these diseases. So something that's completely preventable, something that if we gave people healthy, nutritious food, and there was a question in the chat about what eating well means. We have a kind of a view on this within the Feast Project, which I'll briefly present. If we try to ensure that everybody in Europe was able to eat well, we might be able to prevent a lot of these conditions. This curve comes from an epidemiologist called Geoffrey Rose, who was at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And in 1985, he wrote a seminal paper called Sick Individuals and Sick Populations. And what he talks about is, if we look at our healthcare systems and the health of our populations, if we look at this orange, yellow, bell-shaped curve, what Rose says is that most healthcare systems focused on the highest risk groups. So on the X or horizontal axis is risk of getting severely sick, low risk, medium risk, high risk, and on the Y or vertical axis is the percentage of the population. And what Rose says is that most healthcare systems focused on this highest risk group. These are people with type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, overweight. They might smoke, they might drink too much, they have poor diets. They are at the highest risk of having a heart attack or a stroke. But what Rose says is that if you look at aggregate morbidity, mortality, and spend, it's always in the bell of the bell-shaped curve. And if you don't shift the entire risk profile to the left, it will continue drifting to the right. And shifting the entire risk profile to the left is the only way you can actually improve the health of the population. If the risk profile continues drifting to the right, and this is some of the stuff that Samuela was mentioning and that Tim was also alluding to, the intensity and cost of interventions will continually increase. I started working in the England Department of Health in 2011, and in that year we were spending £110 billion per year in England to deliver the National Health Service. Fast forward to 2019, we were spending £140 billion. Life expectancy declined for the first time since World War II. Health inequalities increased, and the incidence of these non-communicable diseases, these preventable conditions, also increased. Fast forward to now, 2025, we're spending £185 billion per year. We have massive health inequalities. We have a continually reduced life expectancy, and we have a 6 million person backlog. So what Rose predicted in 1985 is exactly what's happening right now. The health of our population is drifting to the right. And the upshot of that is that taxpayers, us, we are spending more and more money on less and less health. The intensity and cost of interventions has increased, but the health of our population has decreased. And we continue to spend more and more money. In the Feast Project, what we're committed to is to make it easy for all people in Europe to eat delicious, healthier, more sustainable food. Three kind of broad nuances on this statement. The first thing is we say all people in Europe. So we're not saying European citizens. We are saying all people in Europe, and we're also not saying Europeans because some people living in Europe don't identify as Europeans, even if they're not European citizens. Just because they're living here doesn't mean they necessarily culturally identify as European citizens, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have access to affordable, healthy, nutritious food. The second nuance is we say we want to make it easy for all people. So a lot of the rhetoric right now and a lot of the statements are that we need to change the behavior of individuals in Europe so that they eat more healthily and more sustainably. But I think a more fundamental question is, does everybody even have an opportunity to eat more healthily and more sustainably? So going to London, there's a borough in London called Tower Hamlets, where they have a childhood obesity problem, and they also have 42 fried chicken shops per secondary school. So is it easy for these kids to eat healthily? And then we also see the cost of healthy food is actually quite exorbitant as well. So people don't actually have easy access to healthy food. So in Feast, we want to look at changing the behavior, but we also want to look at the broader food environments and the broader policy contexts at the micro, meso, and macro level to make sure it's easy for all people in Europe to eat healthier, more sustainable, and delicious food. The final bit is we say delicious, healthier, more sustainable food. So I think there was a question in the chat about delicious versus healthy and sustainable. I personally don't think there needs to be a trade-off there, because I think healthier and more sustainable food can also be delicious as well. It doesn't have to be these things high in sugar, fat, salt. I think there's a lot of delicious food that's also very nutritious as well. I think it might require some reprogramming of palates, certainly, but I think we can also frame it as being delicious. It doesn't have to be this trade-off of it's either nutritious or it's delicious. I think we should look at both. And we're also saying healthier and more sustainable. So what we're not advocating for is that everybody become a vegan overnight, but what we are advocating for is that at least they are starting on that journey. So I've spent a lot of time on this slide just so that we're a little bit clear on positionality. Now, looking at the outcomes that we would want our food systems to achieve, this is really touching on that center of one of Tim's first slides. So we take a One Health perspective, which comes from the WHO, which is looking at both human health and environmental health, both of them as being ends in themselves rather than means to an end. And so we're looking at both human health, so increased food security and better health, environmental health, which we could broadly disaggregate into looking at soil health, biodiversity, reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, optimize water use, improve land use, and then looking at the economy as well. Increased employment, more just distribution of revenue to farmers and small businesses as well. So, looking at the future of agriculture and food systems in Europe, at least from a political perspective, this was a European Commission's 2024 to 2029 objectives that were published last year. And one of their key objectives is to build a competitive and resilient agriculture and food system and safeguard biodiversity to support our farmers and safeguard our healthy food. A lot of interesting stuff in here, but I think as Tim was kind of digging deep into the meaning of some of these words, what do we actually mean by competitive? What do we mean by resilient? Because there are multiple definitions. This word safeguard is also quite interesting, and I think it sort of ties into some of the stuff that Tim was covering on defense. So if we look at competitiveness and we just break this down a little bit, I won't do resilience because I think Tim covered this quite well already. Looking at the business as usual definition, which is coming from kind of the World Economic Forum, they're really looking at economic competitiveness. And their definition is the set of institutions, policies, and factors that determine the level of productivity of a country. Okay, so a competitive economy means that they have higher productivity. Higher productivity leads to growth. Growth leads to higher income levels, and higher income levels leads to improved well-being. This is their definition. This is not my positionality. This is me just breaking down the definitions of what's being used, just so that we have a starting point. And what they have come up with is this inclusive development index. So they're comparing the economic competitiveness of different countries. And this was the basis for Draghi's report, where he's kind of positioning Europe as being less competitive than the US and China, which was something that Samuele mentioned in his opening. And they kind of break this down into three broad groupings. You have growth and development, inclusion, and integrate intergenerational equity and sustainability. And this looks great, actually. There's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with this, but there's a lot of nuances in terms of how these factors are actually leveraged in practice particularly in the policy landscape, and the power imbalances that mean that some of these factors are propelled and prioritized over some of the other factors. And the World Economic Forum also kind of does a mea culpa about this as well, looking at the externalities. And their kind of stance on this is that there's so many factors that are not included in their competitiveness framework. And the inclusiveness of economies is one thing that is not really included. And again, their mea culpa is that they haven't found a good way to include environmental stewardship into their calculations, which I think is a really big caveat in terms of their model, considering the climate shocks that we're seeing. And, you know, I think this kind of undermines a lot of the stances that they take. And one thing that we could potentially look at in terms of the negative externalities and the inclusiveness, you know, if we look at Europe, 100 million people, so about, you know, over 20% of the population were at risk of poverty or social exclusion in 2021, and around 10% of people in the EU were unable to afford a proper meal. And on the other side, this is something that Samuele talks about often, and Sophia and the Euro HealthNet team as well. We saw the minting of 62 new billionaires that inflated their profits during the same time period. In the same time period, where 100 million people were at risk of poverty or social exclusion, you have 62 new food billionaires. So this concentration of wealth, they added over 300 billion to their profits. So this is not revenue. The revenue would have been even greater. This is profits that they added to. So on one side, you have people across Europe having these debates of heating versus eating, and some of the stuff that Tim was mentioning, that parents would forego having nutritious meals just so they could provide something to their children. And on the other side, you have these new food billionaires who are deciding whether they should buy their 5th or 6th Ferrari or their 3rd or 4th summer vacation home. It's grossly imbalanced. And there was another publication published by Oxfam, I think last week or the week before, that a very small proportion of these billionaires, they added $2 trillion to their wealth last year. It's so imbalanced. And so, you know, these very nuanced points the World Economic Forum makes about the inclusiveness and the lack of just distribution of societal resources, I think is something that is actually a massive problem. And what does that translate to in terms of economic competitiveness? If you look at the S&P Food and Beverage Select Industry Index, so this is going 10 years, you can see that it's gone up by 6.82% over this 10-year period. So this is what economic competitiveness means, that these companies have made more money. And if I've invested in these companies, and if our pension funds have invested in these companies, they've made a 8.2% return on their investment, which is something that we're looking at in terms of economic competitiveness. But then there's the collateral damage of all the people that can't afford to even eat a decent, healthy meal, or who are eating a bunch of food that's high in sugar, fat, salt, that then predisposes them to the NCDs, the non-communicable diseases, which we then as taxpayers have to pay 700 billion euros per annum. So within Feast, what we see is that our current food systems are lose, 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 win, where our people are suffering and losing, the public sector is suffering and losing, the environment is suffering and losing. And it's really just the large multinationals. So I'm not saying the private sector, I'm saying the large multinationals that are winning. And it's at the expense of all of these other key stakeholders in our food systems. And we also see this on a policy perspective as well, that this drive towards competitiveness means that we're making cop-outs on a lot of really important policy initiatives. So our kind of reason of existence in Feast was the Farm to Fork initiative, which I think was a pretty good policy document that mapped out a very holistic view of what the future food systems in Europe should look like. And this is food by food systems. I'm talking about the entire value chain, going from primary production to processing, distribution, retail, consumption, and waste. I think it was a very comprehensive document. And we prepared the feast proposal on the idea and the notion that the Farm to Fork initiative would actually be implemented. Because when we were preparing the proposal, it seemed like a foregone conclusion that actually, yes, of course, this is going to be implemented. But lo and behold, last year, what we found that it was completely derailed. And what we see on the other side is these reports that not only about the lobbying and the corporate capture and regulatory capture, but also these very skewed uses and distributions of our public sector resource, our taxes. 1,200 times more public funding and 3 times more lobbying money goes to animal source food products as compared to plant-based food products. And this is the complete opposite direction of where we should be traveling. And again, this is all in the name of economic productivity, competitiveness, growth. But it's a very skewed way of, and very narrow way of looking at our food systems. And the hidden costs of the way our global agri-food systems are currently set up is $10 trillion per year. This is per year that we have in terms of direct costs as well as externalities, the negative externalities of our food systems. And again, going back to the World Economic Forum kind of inclusiveness index, they're also looking at future generations. Now, these are costs that our future generations are going to have to pay for. Now, von der Leyen, who herself has 7 kids, I mean, it just buggers belief as to what are we doing for future generations? We take this very basic concept of stewardship, where the good steward leaves the land or our societies in better condition than when we received it. Our public sectors and private sectors, particularly the macro level, I would argue are not being good stewards, and it leaves us very, very vulnerable, and it keeps our food systems in a very unresilient state. And again, it's just for the benefit of a very, very narrow sector of our society. 0.000001% of our population is benefiting from the way our current food systems are set up. So now, that's the World Economic Forum. Now, taking that lens and looking at the Draghi view, this is the report that was published in September 2024, The Future of European Competitiveness. And this is something that Samuele was mentioning. Now, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into this. And the purpose is to explore it a little bit further, the good and the bad, with the view of seeing whether we could reframe competitiveness for a slightly more rational and reasonable view, kind of overlaid onto our food systems. So these are direct quotes taken from the Draghi report. And these are the 3 action areas that he positions in terms of looking at reigniting our growth. And again, this is competitiveness, which leads to productivity. Productivity leads to growth. Growth leads to higher incomes. Higher income leads to more well-being. So the positionality is always that higher incomes are a prerequisite to well-being within our society. A very kind of neoliberal capitalist view. So, like Samuele mentioned, this is sort of like kind of a level of insecurity at being left behind, particularly with respect to the US and China, and looking at advanced technologies, looking at our large industries, and looking at these unicorn companies that have a valuation of 1 trillion or more. So again, what we're looking at here, again, is this notion that we need to have this concentrated wealth. That is seen as a good from this framing. They're looking at decarbonization as a second area, which could be good. But again, it depends on how it's done. And as Molly talks about in her book, who are the winners and who are the losers? The third area is looking at security and reducing dependencies. Peace is first and foremost an objective of Europe. And he also talks about strengthening our defense industrial capacity. So being able to produce more weapons, basically. There's an entire section in the Draghi report which looks at the fact that in the US, there's like 1 or 2 tanks that are used, whereas in Europe, there's 12. So how can we harmonize our production of tanks so that you can kind of look across the board, across Europe, and have this kind of economies of scale and coordination in terms of the use of our weapons. Now, what I wanted to do was to look at keyword searches, to look at these words. And again, I go back to my positionality. So these are the things that matter to me. Now, if I was a billionaire, these words probably would not be as meaningful. What I'd probably be looking for is growth and profit and productivity and those sorts of things. But these are the words that matter to me. So for better or worse, these are the things that I looked for. So looking at equality, equity, health, and different conditions and determinants of health, like I talked about at the beginning of my slide. I highlight, firstly, what there's absolutely no mention of. There's no mention of inequities, well-being, obesity, overweight, hypertension, depression, suicide, mental, as in mental health, alcohol or tobacco use, which are key drivers of well-being and competitiveness if you're looking at your workforce, right? Looking at equality and equity, there are some words that are highlighted. So in green, I think these are good things that we could potentially leverage from the report directly for our purposes. Health is mentioned, but mostly in a pharmaceutical context. So there's an entire section devoted to health, but if you dig down deeper, it's looking at how we can produce more pharmaceuticals and how we need to be more competitive from the perspective of being able to produce more medicines. Diabetes is mentioned once in the full report. Anxiety is mentioned once in the brief report, once in the full report. Stress is only mentioned once in the brief report, 10 times in the full report. Determinants, education is really the only one that's really strongly mentioned. Again, it's from the perspective of creating a better workforce, though. So it's not looking at education as an end in itself. It's looking at education as a means to an end of creating better employees, basically, who are able to get better jobs. So looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly, again, from my vantage point and my positionality. So you could disagree, but this is kind of my positionality looking at One Health. What I think is good. So a European approach must ensure that productivity growth and social inclusion go hand in hand. So I think this is something that we should shout from the rooftops. And later on in my slides, in terms of looking at regenerative food systems, a la what Molly talks about, I think this could be used as a statement to support that. We must keep the social fabric intact. These are direct quotes. I think we can use this. The European welfare state will therefore be critical to provide strong public services, social protection, housing, transport, and childcare during this transition. So I think this is fantastic, looking at the determinants. Ensure that all workers have a right to education and retraining. Cohesion policies will need to be refocused on areas such as education, transport, housing, digital connectivity, and planning. Again, fantastic from my perspective. These are tackling and looking at the determinants. What's not mentioned here is food, but we'll get to that. Another thing that I think is really great, empowering people. So this touches on some of the stuff that Tim was mentioning and some of the stuff that Molly mentions as well in her book. Engage with all actors within the respective societies to define objectives and actions. I think that's fantastic. Looking at democracy, looking at communities. Effective and proactive citizens' involvement and social dialogue. A strong social contract. Again, I think these are things that we must use proactively and shout from the rooftop. So if you have the billionaires coming to you and saying that economic productivity must trump everything, we need to come back to them and hit them hard with these quotes, which are also in the Draghi report. Europe's fundamental values are prosperity, equity, freedom, peace, and democracy in a sustainable environment. The EU exists to ensure that all Europeans can always benefit from these fundamental rights, preserving our values of equity and social inclusion. Again, we must shout this from the rooftops. Anytime this is not being met, we can just like the capitalists and neoliberalists will talk about this, we must also bring these points back up. Digitalization can help to make Europe's social model more robust and fair, especially in the key areas of education and public health. So again, going back to Tim's slide about IoT and how digital is kind of integrating into our food systems. It can be used for ill, but it can also be used for good. And we need to ensure that it's used for good. The ugly. If Europe cannot become more productive, we will be forced to choose. So we need to ration. We will not be able to finance our social model. We will have to scale back some, if not all, our ambitions. Now, this is kind of code word for a lot of the social welfare stuff. So we need to make these hellish decisions. And a key thing is who's going to be at the table when these trade-offs are made and these decisions are made. And the ugly. So here is where food security is mentioned. And again, this is a direct quote. In parentheses, food security here is equated with lack of fertilizers and pesticides. What is going on? This is such a narrow view on food security. It doesn't reference FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization's dimensions on food security or food agency or anything like this. There's a very, very narrow view on fertilizers and pesticides. So this is something I think we need to push back on, and we need to push back on hard. And to also highlight that this is internally inconsistent with the notion of looking at environmental sustainability, and that food security also is a social right. And we have to have access, like we would say in Feast, to easy access to delicious, healthier, more sustainable food. So a big question, one, health. Is it a means to an end? The end here being bringing in a bunch of cash, or is it an end in itself? I think the intention of the Draghi report is probably to see it as an end in itself. But because of some of the good quotes that I presented, I think we can try to reframe it as an end in itself. So here's our feastified view of competitiveness. It is not a means to an end. One health is seen as an end in itself. And these hidden costs of our global agri-food systems, if we're already paying 10 trillion per year, then what we would say is to reshift the focus and try to make sure that that 10 trillion delivers one health. So in the same way that I personally don't want to accept this trade-off between being delicious versus being nutritious, I think we should be both. I think we should create a win-win-win-win, so our food systems are benefiting all stakeholders. And again, I have nothing against the multinationals, so I don't want them to lose. But what I don't want is for them to be winning at the expense of all of the other key stakeholders in our food system. They have infrastructure, they're creating jobs, that's great. But I don't think it should be done at the expense of our resilience, in the sense that there's far too much concentrated power and it makes us vulnerable. And in terms of competitiveness, why don't we say that Europe will have the most regenerative food system? And here I take a direct kind of definition from Molly, and Molly will talk more about this. Food systems must not only sustain some status quo, but also create and restore ecological integrity, social justice, community viability, equity, and public health in order to achieve well-being for all. And we conceptualize regeneration as a holistic approach that moves past neutral environmental impacts towards the creation of effects of a mutually supportive symbiosis across the food system. And again, what I would stress here is it's food systems, it's regenerative food systems, not just regenerative agriculture. So what Molly's look at is the entire food value chain. And I think that's what we need to shift to. And a lot of this is completely aligned with those green quotes from the Draghi report. And I think, again, we need to shift it, shout this from the rooftops. So a reconceptualization of the World Economic Forum view on competitiveness. So let's say a competitive food system has high regenerative productivity. The regenerative productivity leads to regenerative growth. The regenerative growth leads to high regenerative capital. And here capital is not just financial capital, it's also social, human, moral, and financial capital. And the high regenerative capital will lead to increased One Health. There are quotes within the Draghi report that we can use to frame this, and I think that's what we need to do. So in the interest of time, I won't go through these, but you guys will get these slides. And taking direct quotes, we're looking at enhancing the ability of living beings to co-evolve in ways that allow for diversity, complexity, and creativity. This also touches on resilience. It also means that if we're hit with a shock, we have more options. So we're not putting all of our eggs in one basket. And this sort of boggles the mind for me about the capitalist and neoliberal perspective, because investors never want to put all of their eggs in one basket. Their mantra is always to diversify investment so that if something fails, you have the other investments. The kind of bog standard is you do 60% in equity and 40% in bonds, or vice versa. If you're older, you put 60% in bonds and 40% in equities. As you get older, so you reduce your risk. And you never put all of your eggs in one basket. Whereas with our food systems, like Tim was pointing out, we have this very concentrated way of how we're allocating our resources and trust in a very narrow set of companies. And it is completely counter to what Economics 101 would suggest and Investment 101 would suggest. So again, this is where I think we completely align regenerative food systems and the Draghi report. Regenerative food systems will help to keep the social fabric intact. They will help to empower people, engage with all actors, and allow for, and not only allow for, but proactively implement effective and proactive citizen involvement and social dialogue, strengthen our social contract, and really touch on these fundamental values of the EU. So I'll stop there. Turn over to Sophia.
Perfect. Thank you, Anand. Thanks a lot for these presentations. I think that it really complements well with Tim's presentation, providing some numbers and with analysis of the Draghi report. I think that this really gives a picture of like a bigger problem, and and providing ways of like alternative ways of framing competitiveness in a way that also supports competition, but mostly that could promote a healthy and sustainable food system. For interest of time, I was monitoring now the chat, and I think that there are some questions that that might be automatically answered by the next speaker. But I think that we have time for one question, and is on reflecting on the process of achieving a shared understanding and shared goals of our food and food system. So is it a battle of evidence and ideology, or is it a matter of beliefs, personal interest, or a lack of capacity of knowledge, of education, of seeing the complexity of the world and the way it's evolving? So I don't know if Anand, if you would like to elaborate a little bit on that.
I would echo some of the stuff from Tim about the community, and then also kind of as a preview of what I think Molly will speak about, and what's certainly in her book, is that it's not a centralized role to define what a food system should be or how it should transition. It's the community's kind of role. And if we want these decentralized, more local, small, community-driven food systems, it will increase our resilience, but it also means that they need to shape it based on their needs and priorities. So it's not for us to dictate. What we can try to do as much as possible is to give clean, clear knowledge in an accessible format. And by that, what I mean is not a 50-page academic article that even academics can't understand, with 100 pages of supplementary material on the methods that nobody understands, but just really basic information, so that communities can make a choice, or have a choice, know that it's within their rights to actually choose how they shape and design their food systems. This is where food sovereignty comes in, where food democracy comes in. Samuele has done a lot of work on this with our colleague Andreas, looking at power, food commons, food democracy, which Molly also touches on in her book. So yeah, I don't think it's for us to dictate. I think it's for us to facilitate as much as possible, and then over time for the communities to actually take charge of it themselves. And I would avoid the word empower in these instances, because that would imply that we have the power, and it's within our right to give people power. And if we are on vacation, then they're not going to be empowered. Whereas it's, the power is for them to just take. It's not for us to give. So I think they have to have that sense of agency. One last thing that I would kind of maybe touch on is Paulo Freire's classic stuff on the pedagogy of the oppressed, because I think many of our communities are in this state of oppression, where they don't realize that it's within their right to actually choose what they want and don't want. And this might be why we're seeing this kind of shift to far right and authoritarian kind of perspectives in our societies currently, is because they feel that they've been forgotten. And the authoritarians create this kind of platform where folks think that they're being heard, and they're creating an alternative for the communities to participate. But anyways, I'll stop there because I think Molly will articulate this much better than me, and I can just keep rambling on.